From New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, this is Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. I'm David Weston. It is a big day today down at Cape Canaveral, Florida, as they have scheduled the first launch of astronauts from U.S. soil into space for the first time in 9 years now. And it's being done as a joint venture between NASA, a government agency, and SpaceX, Elon Musk's SpaceX, a private company. I talked earlier today with the Administrator of NASA, he is Jim Bridenstine, about this relationship and exactly what each party brings to this launch.
We're largely focused on the International Space Station, but we are also the customer for this launch. So as the mission management team goes through the countdown sequence, we're going to have NASA engineers and NASA flight directors that are going to be side by side with the SpaceX engineers and flight directors. And if at any point we feel uncomfortable with the direction that they're going, of course we can halt the launch. But what NASA is trying to do right now, we are trying to create a robust commercial marketplace in low Earth orbit. That's the goal, which means we need SpaceX to go get customers that are not NASA. We want to be a customer, but we want to be one of many customers. So what we're doing is we're giving SpaceX a lot of leash. In fact, we have contracted for them to actually do the launch almost independently. But make no mistake, our engineers and our technicians have been involved in the development of this capability, and our astronauts have been involved in it. So again, we want to be one customer of many. We are helping to grow this commercial marketplace by being a tenant customer initially, but we also want to have numerous providers that are competing against each other on cost and innovation and safety. And when we achieve that, it's going to transform how we do spaceflight. It's going to bring down costs and it's going to increase access.
So you talked about commercialization, which is particularly interesting to our audience, how that works. When it comes to SpaceX launching satellites, it's pretty clear. A bunch of companies as well as governments need satellites up in orbit. What about for astronauts? Is there the same demand, commercial demand? What's the top line, the revenue there?
Yeah, at this point, the history has been that government creates the demand and then government creates the supply. And so what we're doing here is we're trying to change that paradigm. Certainly we are creating the demand and we're turning to commercial industry to give us the supply. But again, what we want to see eventually is the demand would come from others as well. And so what are we doing right now? We're using the International Space Station to do things like we're creating human organs in 3D, printing human organs in 3D using adult stem cells. Right now, it's just tissue, but eventually it's going to be full organs. And we can only do that in the microgravity of space. If you try to do it on Earth, the tissue just goes flat. But then, of course, it's not just that. It's also using advanced materials to create artificial retinas for the human eyeball. So somebody who has macular degeneration doesn't have to lose their eyesight. It's advanced materials like fiber optics you can create fiber optics in such a pristine way that you don't have to have repeaters, which drives down the cost for fiber optics and it closes the business case for manufacturing in space. We're compounding pharmaceuticals in a way that you cannot do in the gravity well of Earth. We're creating immunizations that you cannot create in the gravity well of Earth. So these are all different markets that we are proving out on the International Space Station, knowing that eventually there's going to be a large capital influx, not just for launch, which is what we're doing today, but also for human habitation in space. And that's really the end state that we're seeking to achieve.
Whenever we talk about commerce, we talk about competition, because that drives commerce to a large degree. Talk about two kinds of competition. One is Boeing against SpaceX, because you've got two horses in the race, but one seems to be lagging behind. Do you need Boeing to catch up? And what about Soyuz? Are you still going to be doing business with Soyuz?
So the Boeing and SpaceX paradigm, I'll talk about that first. So remember, SpaceX was doing commercial resupply of the International Space Station, and they were largely doing it with a lot of the same equipment that they're now going to be doing commercial crew with. Boeing did not participate in commercial resupply. So Boeing went straight from nothing to commercial crew. So that's a lot harder of a starting position. And so yes, they are a little bit behind right now. And of course, it cost us a little more to get them ramped up because of their starting position. That being said, we are committed to having two partners in this future that we envision, but we also believe this is important. There are other companies right now that are stepping up to the plate that want to be part of this. Sierra Nevada Corporation, Blue Origin, which is Jeff Bezos's organization. So there's other partners out there on the horizon for this commercial marketplace eventuality.
And what about Soyuz? You still going to work with Soyuz? You've spent what $3.5 billion with them over the last 10 years.
That's right. So when we think about the International Space Station, half of it is the United States segment with all of our international partners, and the other half of it is the Russian segment. So if we want to make sure that we keep it crewed with both Americans and Russians, then it will be appropriate for us for Americans to launch on Soyuz rockets and for Russians to launch on commercial crew rockets. Now, that being said, the difference is instead of us going out and buying seats at $90 million a piece, now we're going to be able to do a no exchange of funds trade, which is a very different, it makes it more of a partnership and less of a dependency. So we like the partnership. We want to get ourselves off of the dependency.
Talk about the two astronauts who are scheduled to go up. I mean, you must have some affinity with them. I mean, you are yourself a very accomplished carrier and combat pilot. You must understand some of what they're going through.
Well, I would never suggest that I know what they're going through, but I can tell you for sure that these are the best that America has to offer. Doug Hurley is a Marine Corps test pilot and an amazing individual. Bob Benkin is a flight test engineer from the United States Air Force. And of course, they're both veterans of numerous space shuttle missions. They're both test pilots. Remember what this mission is. This is a test mission. And of course, we almost always have test pilots on test missions. And these are the two right people for this job. And we are very anxious to get them to orbit, get them onto the space station, and get them home safely.
This is a historic moment, no matter what, for the reasons we've talked about. But beyond that, it's not lost on anyone that this is in the middle of a pandemic. How important is it for the United States right now to be returning astronauts to space from United States soil when we are fighting this COVID-19?
That's so important. Look, NASA has a long history of doing stunning things in the middle of very difficult times. We go back to the Apollo era. We saw, a war raging in Vietnam and protests in the streets and at the Capitol and at universities. We had civil rights abuses and civil rights protests. And of course, we were in the height of the Cold War. And in the midst of all of that, we were able to send Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the surface of the moon. And for that unique moment in time, everybody in the country united, and we all looked up and we dreamed bigger dreams. And because of that moment, there are so many people at NASA that are doing even more amazing work today. We need to create those stunning achievements to inspire the next generation. Yes, we're in the midst of the coronavirus pandemic. NASA has been very aggressive in having people work from home. We did that intentionally because we wanted to protect this mission. There is nothing more important for us right now than launching American astronauts on American rockets from American soil, something that we have not done since 2011, the retirement of the space shuttles. So we protected this mission. We're now at the point where we're getting ready to launch, and we can do it. We can do it, and we've done it safely. We've given everybody personal protective equipment. We've made sure that we've got social distancing, that we're dividing up shifts so that we're minimizing contact when working on the vehicle. All of these things put us in a position to have a successful mission. And yes, this is our legacy, and we can do it today just as we did it in the 1960s.
That was Jim Bridenstine. He is the administrator of NASA on the eve of this historic launch down at Cape Canaveral. Coming up here, Disney has big news today as it announces plans to open its theme parks in Florida. We'll bring you that. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Well, the markets seem to be telling us something about a rebound, although the economic numbers don't necessarily bear it out yet. Well, BlackRock has a person who's responsible for both the fixed income side and the equity side. He is Rick RIEDER. He's the fixed income chief investment officer, and he's also head of the BlackRock global allocation team. He's here to sort this all out for us. So welcome, Rick. Really great to have you. Let's start on the fixed income, if we could. What is going on with credit? because, boy, people really want to buy it. If you look at the triple C's and things like that, is that because of something going on in the real world, or is that just the Fed?
So, no, not so much. I mean, what the Fed has done has been pretty powerful. But, there is something that I think people underestimate when you think about what the Fed does, what central banks can do. When they wheel out the bazooka and say, this is what we will do if we need to, the markets tend to take them at their word, particularly as Fed that has a lot of credibility today. So the Fed actually hasn't done a lot in the credit markets at all. But what's happening is there's a sense that the Fed will be there for emergency reasons or to provide for markets to actually function effectively. So what's happening now is you're seeing a manifestation of what the Fed has done is take interest rates to zero. They're going to keep them at zero for an extended period of time. And as long as the economy is reasonably stable, then this demand for income, and I know we've talked about it a bunch of times, the demand for income in the world because of the aging demographic, et cetera, is so profound. And as long as people feel like, gosh, I need to, the economy's going to be stable, I can start to go and get that income. And then when you think about the size of the high yield market, David, it's only $1 trillion market. If you think about the market cap of Amazon, it's more. It's been, and you think about Amazon's bigger than the entire high yield market. There's not enough income in the world, and so what you're seeing is this. Gosh, I got to get income. Economy's doing better. I'm anticipating it will continue to do better, and so the surge of money that's come in has been impressive to say the least.
So as a result, yields are really suppressed, I would say, and it's reasonably cheap still to borrow money despite everything that's happened. Does that sort of give governments a blank check for stimulus? We had two former central bankers, Carstens and Weber, today come out and say this is really dangerous because we're basically going to have the central banks funding the government debt.
So, that's a long, complicated discussion, but I would say a couple of things that are really important. One is there is something that's really profound about the ability for the governments to actually borrow today. I'm not saying there's an unlimited amount the governments can borrow. They have to be conscious of you can put too much debt on a system, you create a crowding out effect for the corporate sector, households, financials, et cetera. But today, because of the demographic we talked about, the system is actually set up to be a lender. Insurance companies, pension funds actually need the assets and actually need to lend. And what's happened when you drop rates to so low, it's causing people to say, gosh, where do I go to actually be a lender? And so in today's environment, you can actually create some more debt on the system as long as you're creating nominal GDP, which I would argue in the US, we will have some improvement, significant improvement in nominal GDP to pay down the debt over time. But I think it's fair to say we shouldn't go too far, but to put a bit more debt on the system, given the circumstances, is actually not as scary as it's been historically. Think about it, when we were back in 06, 07, the households were indebted because of the housing market, the financials were indebted. We're in a better position today. That being said, you've always got to be pragmatic about it. You can't just keep doing it. And but we can afford to do a little more debt, certainly to get to the other side of what is a shock to the economic system.
So Rick, that's the fixed income side of your book. Let's go over the equity side, because a lot of people are saying, boy, the equities look like they're pretty high considering what we're really seeing in the economy. Are the equities telling us something meaningful about the recovery?
Well, the first is we can't leave the fixed income side because it's part of why the equities are doing what they're doing. When you move interest rates to zero, then you're basically telling people you would need to find something else to do. And when you can't create income in other ways, you need to find something else to do. And you create this transmission effect that gets into the discount rate on equities, it gets into the alternative assets that equities are. And listen, I think the equity market is too high on a short-term basis, given what the economy is telling you. But part of what I think people have been maybe a bit short-sighted about is you don't buy equities for the next quarter. And people talk a lot about next quarter and PE ratio off of this year. If you go over the intermediate term and think about, gosh, we're going to have low interest rates for a long time, and you think about where earnings are going to be over a long period of time, because equities are a long duration, the longest duration asset there is. Equity valuations, when you take equity risk premium and think about where we are versus on a low interest rate, on a low level where companies can borrow and actually buy back their stock if they want to, equities are not high. I mean, I think they can go higher. I mean, near term, do I think they should pull back a little bit? Probably. But, if you're building balance in your portfolio and you're a long-term investor or medium-term investor, to hold equities in the portfolio, versus owning, you're not going to make any money owning the 10-year Treasury note at 68 basis points, 69 basis points. So I do think that equities make sense as long as you're an investor and can be thoughtful about, gosh, I'm not going to look at, could I go down in the next week or so? You could go down a bit, but I think people are underestimating equities for the intermediate to long haul are actually still okay value here.
Okay, you're making me feel better, Rick. Thank you so much. It's always a treat to have you with us. That's Rick RIEDER from BlackRock. And coming up next, we're going to get to talk about the Walt Disney Company and reopening some theme parks down in Florida. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. The Walt Disney Company is making big news today as it announces its plans. It has to be approved, but its plans to reopen theme parks down in Florida. So my company that I have a lot of love for, used to work for, is really making the news. And we're going to turn to my colleague, Emily Chang now, who has the CEO of the Walt Disney Company. Emily?
Thank you, David. Joining us now, Bob Chapek, the CEO of Disney. Bob, thank you so much for joining us. You have just laid out your reopening plan for Disney World to Florida officials starting July 11th, July 15th for Epcot Center. A lot of the same things you're doing in Shanghai: face masks, temperature checks, social distancing. What makes you feel confident in the safety of this plan, and what has been the reaction from officials so far?
Well, we always said we would not open up again until we thought we could do so responsibly. We've got some learnings from Shanghai. We've got some learnings from our own Disney Springs retail and dining area that we opened up just a week ago. And we've been able to make some learnings in terms of how you keep that social distancing. That is the key for us, keeping that 6 feet social distancing, no matter whether are people in restaurants, whether on Main Street, or whether they're in attractions. And we're confident that we can do that and open up responsibly.
That said, Universal is planning to open up June 5th. Why a month later?
Well, for us, we feel that this is the right time for us in July. We've got a different situation, frankly, than Universal does because we're much bigger. We have a much more complex business. We've got a different labor situation. And at the same time, we're also going to be implementing a new reservation system for our guests. And it's going to take some time to take the millions of reservations that we've already got on the books and then switch that over to a new reservation system. So we think July is the right time for us.
So let's talk about some of your learnings from Shanghai. You've been open there since May 11th. You've been doing these temperature checks. Are people actually showing up with fevers and getting turned away? Have you gotten to that 30% capacity yet? And when do you plan to go beyond that?
Well, everything has gone extremely well at Shanghai, and I must compliment not only our cast, but I must compliment the guests for their cooperation during the whole thing, because it really takes the chemistry between both groups in order to make this whole thing work with social distancing. And, so for us, the learning is that we've stuck to our limitations that we've placed on ourselves, and it's worked extremely well. We're up to about 20,000 guests now that we take per day. And we're maintaining the social distancing guidelines that the government has placed upon us. And we believe that as those social distancing guidelines are relaxed or somehow changed, that we'll be able to actually grow with it and really please even more guests than we can today.
So give us a rough sense of which resorts will be next and when. I know you've gotten the green light to open downtown Disney in California. What about Hong Kong, Tokyo, Paris, and Disneyland itself?
Well, we've got no announcement that we're ready to make on those other parks. As you know, they all are in areas with different situations in terms of the progress of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also different situations in terms of where the government sort of feels they're at and providing some level of assurances that it's going to be responsible to open up. So we have to take our cues from each local government in each place. We always like to say at Disney that we're really just a citizen of the environments that we are operating in, and we want to be a good citizen. And so we really do follow the lead of the local governments as our cue, and then we overlay what we believe is good common sense from a Disney standpoint, and that determines our opening date.
Bob, the Walt Disney Company prides itself in execution, often flawless execution of plans. It also, though, is a planner. You make long-term strategic plans. As you look at the world in this post-pandemic world, has it changed your emphasis on different of your assets? You have a wonderful group of assets, but many of them were based on people getting together, whether it's sporting events, or it's movie theaters, or it's theme parks, or it's cruise ships.
I think over time, some of the fears that people have, and they're warranted fears about getting together in big groups, will eventually dissipate. But it's going to dissipate on the function of trust. And there's not many companies in the world that are trusted as much as the Walt Disney Company. But it's a trust that we will not in any way violate. And so Disney opens up a little later than others. We open up with not as many people inside our parks, but we do that on purpose because we want to build that trust in this new environment. It's a new normal, and then take it from there. So baby steps every step of the way.
No question about it. At the same time, as you allocate capital, and goodness knows your theme parks, your cruise ships have a lot of capital going against them, will you make some adjustments, almost a hedge against the future, in case it doesn't come back as robust as you might expect, into other things, such as, for example, your streaming business, which is doing very well?
Well, we at Disney are fortunate not just to have a broad base of businesses to fall back upon, but a broad group of properties, both in the sports area, as well as in movies, as well as theme parks, as well as in cruise ships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we feel that we're very fortunate to sort of shift things around. In terms of capital allocation, everything that we can see long-term from our guest surveys tell us that Disney parks will be back, our guests will be back. People are really hesitant to cancel their reservations that already exist. So we think we're going to have enough demand over time. Sure, there's going to be some bumps along the way as we have limited capacity, but we've got enough horses in the game, if you will, that we can go ahead and shift things around in the meantime, but be in a really good position, a really strong position, emerge even stronger long-term than we are right now.
Last quick question, Bob. You're planning to open Mulan in theaters July 24th. How do you expect that to go to plan? And how do you expect it to be received in China?
Well, we're bullish on Mulan and the film in itself, but also our ability to get it out in the marketplace at a time where, frankly, there's going to be a lot of peoples that are starved for entertainment and to be able to get out of the house. Now, it's up to our exhibitors to figure out exactly how they're going to plan that social distancing in order to accommodate that. But we're bullish about our date of July 24th, and we're really optimistic that even that exhibition business is going to come back strong.
Bob Chapek, thank you so very much, and Emily Chang as well. This is Bloomberg. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for First Word News. For that, we go to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. The nation's top infectious disease expert says he's hopeful there will be a vaccine for COVID-19 available by the end of the year. Dr. Anthony Fauci also tells CNN recent instances of social crowding, such as a pool party in Missouri, are, in his words, very troubling. He says U.S. testing capability is getting better and that a second wave of coronavirus is not inevitable if people are prudent. The European Commission has unveiled an unprecedented $823 billion stimulus plan. It's aimed at fighting the worst recession in living memory, and it will underwrite Italy's membership in the bloc. The government in Rome would get the single largest chunk of emergency grants and low-interest loans. The package would be funded by joint debt issuance. That would be a significant step toward closer financial integration. The United States has certified that Hong Kong is no longer politically autonomous from China. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says it's a move that could have far-reaching consequences on the special trading status the former British colony has with the United States. China is preparing to pass a new security law giving Beijing more control over Hong Kong. That has sparked new protests. It is a defining moment for Elon Musk and SpaceX. If all goes well, a SpaceX rocket will launch this afternoon from Cape Canaveral carrying 2 NASA astronauts. It will be the first time humans have ever ridden into space aboard a commercial spacecraft. The capsule will dock with the International Space Station 19 hours later. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Quick Take by Bloomberg, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. So, like much of the rest of the country, the securities industry is trying to figure out how to bring its workers back from home, how the safest and best way to do that is. And so the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association has really polled its members and said, what are the best practices as you're planning to come back? And they presented a paper now exactly giving some outlines of what to do. We welcome now the CEO of SIFMA. He is Ken Benson. So, Ken, thanks so much for being here, because this is what we're all interested in. We just heard about Walt Disney Company, what they're going to try to do with its theme parks. Give us an outline of exactly what the securities industry thinks it can do in bringing back employees.
Yeah, good afternoon, David, and thank you for having me on. So, SIFMA, we've been in our business continuity planning mode really since January, and worked with the industry to go to working remote, where firms reported up to 95% of their staff were working either in backup sites or from home. And now, over the last couple of weeks, the shift has been when it's time, how can firms begin to return to office in some normal fashion? Now, some firms have reported that they've had some smaller share of staff coming in, but as they start to think in larger terms, what are the considerations that they're going to need to take to work with? And so we surveyed 60 member firms along with a number of industry utilities to come up with this list of considerations that we put together. And they're really broken into areas affecting staff safety, legal liability concerns, employee sentiment and privacy, questions around screening and testing, HR, and of course what the local and federal government directives are, and healthcare advisories. And we broke it down into planning, implementation, legal compliance, communications, and human resources. And of course, every firm will have to tailor their own plan. But what we're trying is the firms collectively coming together and saying, what is everyone thinking about, and how they're going to do this when they feel it's time to start bringing people back in.
Well, and when you talk about start bringing people back in, one of the things you talk about is really doing some prioritizing of who comes in and not bringing everybody back in at once. Interestingly, traders are sort of at the top of your list, but you also say you should be 6 feet apart. The trading floors I've been on don't have 6 feet between the desks. Is that doable?
Well, firms are certainly working on that now. The whole question around PPE and spacing and social distancing, firms have been spending a lot of time on figuring out how they can do it. You're right in terms of who are the first people that firms will hope to bring back in will be in the sales and trading and front office, followed by firm funding and payments. And, things like IT support, compliance, operations, will probably be in the later phases along with advisory. But you're right, firms and we go into this a whole host of logistical and office planning concerns that firms have to take into consideration as they bring back in a mass, as well as things like split shifts, how you deal with getting people up in elevators, and of course we can't underestimate the whole issues around transportation and how people get in. In many cases in the New York area, obviously using mass transit.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things that stood out for me was the use of benchmarks or rules, because a lot of people are saying, just let me plan. How can I know what's going on? One of the things you suggest is a little bit like what Governor Cuomo has done to some extent with his benchmarks here in New York State, saying, set out some rules and say, when we get to these kinds of numbers, then we'll go to the next phase, but not until then.
Yeah, I think firms, again, every firm will do it what meets their most immediate needs, and many firms are thinking of different ideas, in terms of how will they, what will the offices look like in the future. A lot of firms report that they're not going to rush back in even through the end of the year, and certainly not before there's a vaccine. And further, firms are thinking, longer-term policies of potentially disaggregating staff. And in many cases, staff that may work remotely on a more longer-term basis, possibly permanent basis. And, of course, that raises a whole host of issues around, regulation and compliance, where we've been engaged with our regulators on, if we have a quote-unquote new normal or whatever you want to call it, how do we make sure that we're fit within the rule set, or the rule set fits with that, with that new sort of business model?
Yeah, Ken, as you say, your industry to some extent has already had to adapt to working from home one way or the other. Do you have any sense from your members when they are free to come back, how many people will come back as opposed to how many people will remain at home?
Well, I think in the initial stages, I mean, we're starting to see, the industry largely went to almost 95% work from home, and many are still in that mode today. But we are starting to see, people starting to come back in, particularly in the sales and trading area, in the front office area. But it's still, still at least at 75%, I would say, for most firms as they report to us. Many firms report to us that they're not likely to get back to below 50% before the end of the year. Now, again, everything is fluid, and that could change up or down based upon, the facts on the ground in terms of the vaccine, testing capabilities, and the like. But that's sort of the what you hear on average that firms are thinking about. But again, I've talked to some executives who have said, there are certain people that we found are just as productive working remotely, and for whatever reason may choose to work remotely, and we may endorse that on a permanent basis going forward. Now, what level that is, we don't know at this point in time. So I do think there will be some long-term structural change, even as people are brought back into the office.
Okay, Ken, thank you very much. It's very helpful, very informative. That's Ken Benson. He is CEO.
Yeah, thanks, David.
Of
Always
SIFMA.
good to
Coming
chat.
up here, we are going to talk with the ILO head. He is Guy RIEDER, about the plight of workers around the world in this global recession. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. We turn now to my colleague Sherry Ahn for an interview with the head of the International Labor Organization. Sherry?
David, thank you very much. The International Labor Organization today releasing a report saying that 1 out of 6 young people have stopped working because of the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm now joined by the Director General, Guy RIEDER. Guy, thank you very much for your time today. Your warning of a potential lockdown generation. Why are young people being so heavily affected?
Yeah, I think, thank you for the invitation. I think 3 things are hitting young people in the context of this pandemic. Firstly, you've just given the numbers. Those who were working at the beginning of the pandemic are suffering a high rate of ejection from the labor market. So that's over 1 in 6, as you have said. And even those who are staying in work are having a very severe reduction in income and working hours. So that's the first shock. The second shock is we've seen a dramatic interruption of education and training around the world. And this means that 50% of young people tell us in survey work that they fear that their qualifications are going to be delayed for a long time. 10% think that they simply won't be able to complete their education. So access to skills, acquisition of skills is falling off. And thirdly, in this lockdown economy from which we're suffering, those people who should be entering the labor market more or less right now, they've got nowhere to go. I mean, they really have nowhere to go. And so we've got this accumulation of young people who risk becoming, as we've said, this lockdown generation, because we know from all of the evidence and past experience that young people who are out of the labor market for a significant period, a year or so, at the beginning of their careers, they bear the scars throughout their working lives. We have young people who were thrown out of labor market in 2008 in the financial crisis. They're still not back. They still haven't recovered from the disadvantage. So we should be worried. And
this, of course, coming at a time when young people were already facing challenges even before the COVID-19 pandemic, especially when it comes to young women who have been underutilized. Tell us about this.
You're right. I mean, the pre-pandemic unemployment rate for young people around the world was 13.6%. Now, that's higher than it was before the 2008 crisis. So they never got back. They simply never got back. And what we see, and you're right to emphasize the gender dimension, we see young people, and particularly young women, concentrated in areas of the economy which in any case are highly vulnerable. The informal economy in much of the world, but also in sectors like hotel, catering, retail, wholesale, strong representation of women, and these are the areas which have been decimated by the economic and social impact of the pandemic. So it's disadvantage on top of disadvantage.
So you're warning also of a dire second quarter of 2020. How bad could it be in terms of full-time jobs and working hours lost?
Yeah, we're maintaining the estimation that we previously made that the overall job loss around the world for the second quarter is the equivalent of 305 million full-time jobs compared to the pre-pandemic quarter, the end of 2019. 305 million. And to give you the comparator, the figure for the financial crisis, which I keep harking back to, I know, that was 22, 23 million. So we're in different territory. The question, I think, is how much is going to bounce back in a sort of a V-shaped recovery when people start unlocking? And what will be permanently lost jobs and permanently defunct enterprises? And I don't think we're at the stage where we know the answer to that question, but I think it will become relatively soon apparent.
Because we are already seeing economies start to reopen, then while we're going through this process, how important will testing and tracing be for the job market?
Yeah, we've had a look at the relationship between testing and tracing, and of course, from a health perspective, we know that testing and tracing is a good idea. What we see is that there is a very strong association between high levels of testing and tracing and more benign labor market outcomes. So where testing and tracing has been intense, job losses have been less, and that's because we think, firstly, if you're testing and tracing, you don't have to rely on closures to such an extent. Testing and tracing gives confidence to consumers, to investors, to employers. And when you do start to open up your enterprise, your workplace, being able to rely on the evidence of testing and tracing really makes the job easier and quicker. So there are many good reasons why, from a purely labor point of view, this is a good idea. It's money well spent. Yup, there's a cost involved, but the benefits from that investment look like a good return to us.
So as we head towards that direction, how do you channel the funds and the aid that you need in order to really boost the economies worldwide and the job markets to some productive and decent sectors of the labor market?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing, very, very substantial injections of fiscal and monetary sort of stimuli into our economies. I think what is a little worrying is that despite the positive effects that are generated by that, this is being done country by country. There is very little international flow over from one country to the next. Testing's a great example. Testing and tracing needs to be boosted in the developing world, in sub-Saharan Africa and elsewhere. They don't have the financial nor the technical means to make this investment. It's just one example, and I can point to others where we do need this international dimension in the response. Global challenge, global response. We haven't really quite got it at the moment.
And that may be even harder to come given the ongoing U.S.-China trade tension. So if we're talking about the COVID-19 pandemic really affecting specific sectors of the job markets, whether it's hospitality or travel, do you envision other sectors that could be more badly affected given the rising tensions of trade protectionism as well?
Yeah, certainly the tensions you refer to do not help when we want to try and construct an international common purpose response, because there isn't the appetite for that type of cooperation out there. But on the more specific questions, I mean, we're hearing a lot now about the new normal in the global economy, deglobalization, restructuring in the light of the pandemic. It's very difficult to know what that is actually going to work out and mean. Look at global supply chains, for example. Are we going to see a radical shortening, simplification, resilience building in global supply chains? It seems like a possible policy option, but that's going to also have, on top of the direct effects of the pandemic, further secondary effects which could complicate the story even further.
Guy Ryder, Director General of the International Labour Organization, thank you very much for your time. Sending it back to you, David.
Thank you so much, Sherry. Coming up here, we're going to talk with a Kentucky lawmaker who's charged with trying to figure out what China did about the pandemic. He is Andy Barr, Republican of Kentucky. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. So China continues to crack down on Hong Kong, even as President Trump says that China really hasn't been straight with us about the origins of the coronavirus. Congress has created a task force to look into that very subject, and we welcome now somebody who's been assigned to that task force. He is Republican Congressman Andy Barr of the state of Kentucky. So, Congressman, thank you so much for being with us. Let's start with the basics. What do you think we don't know right now about what happened with China and this virus?
Well, David, great to be with you. And yes, this is a very important task force to investigate not only China's role in the origins of the coronavirus, but the COVID-19 virus and their cover-up and their disinformation campaign that allowed the virus to spread globally, but also the clear and present efforts of China to displace the United States as the world's superpower, and the serious risks that the Chinese Communist Party poses not only to the United States but to the global community, given some of the malign conduct that they're engaged in. Obviously, what you're seeing in Hong Kong is the most recent abuse that we want to confront and address, but there's a whole range of issues from their aspirations with their military to their violation of human rights, to the economic warfare that they're engaged in with Belt and Road Initiative, and a whole range of other concerns that we have.
The Chinese government has shown itself pretty effective at controlling information within China. So if there are things that you need to know, whether it's about the virus or about other issues, how do you hope to get information they don't want you to have?
Well, that's one of the problems, is that, and one of the aspects of the cover-up that we want to examine, the fact that China underreported their initial cases back in December, the fact that they lied about no human-to-human transmission and influenced the World Health Organization to repeat that lie, the cover-up by censoring whistleblowers like Dr. Li Wenliang, who was a doctor in Wuhan who sounded the alarm but ultimately died of the disease, the bureaucracy in Beijing silenced many other whistleblowers by cracking down on social media reports of a very dangerous and highly contagious pneumonia-like virus that was spreading to the hospitals there. That was valuable time that the world lost. And in the process, when the first reports came out about this and spread throughout the international community, many non-governmental organizations, faith-based organizations, the CDC in the United States offered to come in and help contain the contagion, and they were denied access. And that cover-up enabled the spread of the disease. And so, China, the Chinese Communist Party and their actions, they put the whole world at risk, not just health, but the economy. And we need to hold China accountable for that.
So that's the issue, isn't it? Holding it accountable, because certainly it would be nice to know a lot more of these things, but what can be done about it? It's not like we haven't imposed sanctions against China already. We're talking about further sanctions right now, like delisting some companies, changing their trade status, given what's gone on in Hong Kong. Have we done anything yet, the United States, that has actually changed Chinese government behavior?
Well, sanctions, you mentioned, is very important. It's an important tool, and we certainly have not utilized the full range of opportunities that we have in terms of economic sanctions to discourage this kind of malign activity. But there are a number of recommendations that we will be presenting and will be considering. As you mentioned and alluded to, the Senate recently passed a bill that would preclude Chinese companies from issuing securities on U.S. stock exchanges if those companies and the auditors of those companies are not subject to review by the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. It's really just leveling the playing field that investors should be entitled to the audit work papers related to a company's operations in China. just as they are.
If I could just interrupt you there for a second,
access...
Congressman, do you think?
Sure.
Excuse me, Congressman, do you think that will pass the House? Because you say it's passed the Senate. You're in the House. Do you think it's going to pass the House?
We're certainly going to be recommending a similar bill. We may be recommending something that goes further than that legislation. But there are more tools and there's more recommendations that we will be proposing. I think I recently spoke to the chairman of the Export-Import Bank. China has a number of export credit agencies that it uses to further its colonialism through the Belt and Road Initiative. We think we can reimagine and reform the Export-Import Bank to better counter Chinese aggression across the world. In addition, the United States can better utilize our role in the international financial institutions, in the IMF and the World Bank, to counter some of the economic warfare that China is engaged in.
Congressman, we're going to have to leave it there. It's really good, a lot to cover. Please come back. That's Andy Barr, Republican Congressman from Kentucky. And this is Bloomberg.